Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Robyn Walsh. And today we're discussing her contribution to the next quest for the historical Jesus, entitled City and Country. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. That being said, thank you for joining me today, Robyn.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
My first question that I'd like to ask is, when you wrote your contribution and you titled it City and Country, what did you want people to focus on regarding cities and countries? What's the point that you were jiving at?
It's actually the reverse situation where I was asked to contribute and then told that was my topic. And so I didn't actually choose that topic or that title, but I was asked to meditate on that question of, in the quest for the historical Jesus, how does city and country come into play? The way I ended up approaching it was to think in terms of literary strategy. So when we see cities and countries represented in different kinds of imperial literature, and other kinds of literature too, but in this particular time period of the Gospels, what are some of the themes that come out, or what are some of the main ways that those locations are treated, again, within the text itself? I think there's a way in which you could probably approach the topic in talking about archaeology or the historical Galilee or something like that. What I decided to do instead, though, was look at how when Jesus moves from the country to the city within the Gospels, what are some of the things that tend to happen, and what do I see as some of the predominant literary themes that I think we often underappreciate. I don't think that's too strong to say. If we're looking for the Gospels to tell us something different about history in those locations.
What is different about, in your view, what is different about what this book sets up about the next quest for the historical Jesus versus prior quests for the historical Jesus in scholarship?
I think that in this particular case, especially under the guidance of Chris Keith and James Crossley, who are the editors of the volume and who selected the contributors or invited them, there was a concerted effort, and of course I'm not speaking for them, but I think there was an effort to do a little bit less of the kind of historical Jesus research or approach to the historical Jesus that's trying to determine things like, what did he really say or not really say? What are the historical, quote unquote, facts we can derive out of something like the Gospels? And, I understand it can be a little bit confusing sometimes, I think, it sounds like we're both saying that the Gospels can be used as historical documents, but there's no historical value to them, right? And I think sometimes historical Jesus research has had difficulty articulating itself along those lines. I think that it's a matter of trying to focus our lens slightly differently on the material, and that's what's happened in this book, which is looking at topics like city and country in a way that isn't trying to have the age-old debate about what is the historical value of the Gospels for saying something about ancient Jerusalem and so forth, but to say, in terms of what these writers are doing and what they're driving at in the Gospels, in terms of their characterization of Jesus, here are the things that we can identify as historical strategies of authorship. At least that was my reading of it. So it was a much more critical, I think, historically critical view of the historical Jesus project. Very far away from something like the Jesus Seminar, for example, if some of your viewers know what that project was in the 20th century, which was really much more focused on treating these documents as historically reliable in very particular ways and trying to extract that history out of them.
What is your methodology for researching the historical Jesus? And my second part to that question is if you were to research to try to discern a historical Jesus from the literary tropes that you've seen in the Gospels when comparing them to Greco-Roman literature, like Virgil or other texts adjacent to Virgil, how would you distinguish between when the Gospels are being literary and when they're being real about Jesus?
Well, I think we've probably talked about this before. Actually, I think we talked about this in November. I got the pleasure of seeing you at the Society of Biblical Literature conference, which is that our understanding of history is different today, in part I think theoretically than in antiquity, in the sense that in antiquity, I'm not sure they were as concerned with extracting from these texts some kind of concrete fact that can be wielded for other purposes. So I think for my own methodology and approach, I have a much more flexible understanding of what I can get out of these texts. And so when I do try to identify literary tropes, it's not so much. So, for example, in this piece, in the chapter, I compare the way that Jesus is misunderstood or misrecognized or not recognized in the Gospel of Mark, which is usually characterized as the messianic secret. I talk about that in terms of other heroes in the Homeric tradition and the Virgilian tradition, and within Greco-Roman literature, something like the novel, where heroes are often not recognized, or when the hero goes from the country to the city, usually something corrupting happens or something bad happens to the hero. So I'm thinking here about someone like Aesop or Socrates, right? Like usually the city is corrupting. When I see those themes in the text, what I'm interested in is really, I guess you could say, the historical author and what they want us to derive about their understanding of Jesus. So when they use those kinds of motifs, they're trying to tell us about a way to interpret the character that they're writing about, in this case, Jesus. Now, that's not to say Jesus isn't a historical person or, to go into that morass, because this is a kind of thing that writers do for all kinds of figures, historical figures, including people like the emperors, just for example. So that's what I'm trying to look at. So maybe that would be the shift we would say, is I'm looking at the historical author and what they want us to take out of the person they're talking about and why they're interested in us drawing those conclusions, more so than a contemporary historical idea of like, this is fact and this is fiction, and where is that line and how do I extract that from the text? I'm not sure that's what the text is trying to do.
What kind of complications do you see in any attempt to try to with the goal in any journey to try to reconstruct the historical Jesus? Given what you've said, that there's a lot of Greco-Roman influence on the Gospels, the literary tropes are very similar. Is it even possible to actually meet the goals of a quest like this, in your view? Can it be done, or is it hopeless?
So in this case, you're thinking like the traditional quest to be able to say concrete things about the historical Jesus. Is that what you mean? Like, can we do that particularly?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think what becomes, maybe we could say, like, not satisfying particularly about that effort is that you have to be content with pretty broad strokes. I think we can say some pretty general things about the historical Jesus, in the sense that we think he really existed. We really think that he was a man from Judea. We really think he was Jewish. He had a certain number of followers. He was in a tradition of someone like John the Baptist, even if the idea that he was his cousin or he was his teacher is maybe fabricated. We can debate that. Those kinds of things. He went to Jerusalem. He was crucified, right? We can reconstruct some of those things. But they are, again, pretty broad. And then when you delve into the details, that's where you can start to have debates about, how much does this one aspect look like some kind of literary trope, or maybe it is historical, but it's been presented as a literary trope. And I think we just have to be flexible and open-minded about it. But it's not going to get you, I think, the really, fine grain and quote unquote reliable information. And I think that's how, a lot of different kinds of interpretations can emerge about that project. That it takes all kinds of different, there are different facets to how that project can be perceived. In part because, we have to be comfortable with ambiguity and just general information. So I don't think we can derive as much as people want, but I think we can say a few things.
So now I want to ask you about Mark's Christology. What is his Christology?
This is an interesting question. So, I mean, there's various ways I could answer this. One thing that I do, if I could go back to the piece that we're talking about in the volume that I wrote, because I do focus on Mark. So one thing that I talk about there is that in terms of Mark's Christology, it has been very, I think, defined by the work of a scholar named Verda, who wrote a book in German that was then translated about what he generally calls the messianic secret. So this idea in Mark that people don't seem to recognize Jesus until a certain point of the text. So he performs these miracles or these other kind of wondrous acts, and the witnesses around, and even the disciples, often the disciples are called dim-witted, don't seem to understand the significance of what they're seeing or who Jesus was. And so he describes this as a Christological strategy, and he does it, in my view, in very psychological, kind of almost Freudian terms when you read the book, that like this is what Jesus is thinking and this is what Jesus wants, really personalizing the character in the Gospel of Mark. But he defines this as a Christological perspective that sees Jesus as, some people will say, a reluctant Messiah, that he knows once he's revealed as who he is, he's going to be crucified, and he's trying to delay that. Or that kind of Christology would be like a low Christology, that he seems more human in the text. There's also debates about how to make sense of the fact that the baptism seems to be the thing that makes him God's son, and there isn't a genealogy in Mark, that kind of perspective. My take on this, and what I talk about in the chapter, is that the Messianic secret really doesn't get us at that literary strategy that I'm talking about. It seems to do so in the sense that it's describing something that happens in the text. But if you do look at something like the lack of recognition of who Jesus is, especially after he performs miracles throughout the Gospel of Mark, then it looks much more like something you would find in Homer when the hero goes home and no one knows who he is. And in my case, I argue that it looks very much like Virgil, where there are subversive figures who, someone like Camilla, who will come into a town, and the language, even though in Latin, it has the exact same kind of resonance as you have in the Gospel of Mark. In Mark, the Greek word is thauma, which means something akin to wonder or amazement, sometimes even confusion or bewilderment. That same language and those same constructions, and I show many comparisons in the chapter, is exactly what you see in the Gospel of Mark. So I would say that Christology tends to be classified as a low Christology, one of a Jesus and his disciples struggling through the humanity of what he is about to face, and all of that may be a correct theological interpretation. On the literary register, however, it's a very, very common trope, I would say, or a common strategy or structure to have this kind of wonder language surrounding a hero who's not being properly acknowledged, or who is so unique that it's very confusing for the eyewitnesses, and in a way then the eyewitnesses, and in this case the disciples as well in Mark, become avatars for the reader. Especially if you're being introduced to Jesus for the first time, you're going to also be mesmerized, confused, maybe even doubtful about the kind of miracles that are being described and the activities being described. And so that, as a literary strategy, leads you as a reader also on a process of recognition. And so I wouldn't really describe that as Christology, but for those who like that kind of term, I think that's what's going on in terms of Verda's interpretation.
So who exactly is Phlegon? And can you give us a couple of examples of where Phlegon has strong parallels with the Gospel of Mark?
Sure. So he is an ancient paradoxographer. And paradoxography in antiquity were usually collections of some miraculous, noteworthy, or extraordinary events. And we actually, have a few examples of this, and sometimes this kind of literary activity is embedded in other kinds of texts. But in that case, we have an actual collection of his works that have only been translated, I think, once by a man named Hansen. So we do have an English translation, but it's also available in Greek. It's been preserved, his work. And what it looks like is almost like a saying source. And depending on how it's been compiled, in the case of Hansen's translation, he did it by theme. And some of the Greek looks like this as well that I've looked at. But he'll collect different kinds of extraordinary like ephemera. So you'll see something like long-lived persons, and he'll give a list of locations where he's heard somebody who lived for an extraordinary long time and how long they lived, and give you some small details about their lives sometimes just like the one line about, I heard somebody in such a place lived to be 120 years old, something like that. But he also gives details that, sort of smack of like Heroditus or somebody like that about extraordinary things that happened in far off places too. So he'll talk about, I think the example I give in the chapter was a taxidermied centaur. I think that was the example, but a taxidermied centaur that is in the storehouse of the emperor. And so that taxidermied centaur shows that centaurs are real. It's from an exotic place, and so your imagination can run wild with that kind of information. But it is just sort of a compendium of all these sort of extraordinary facts and figures, places, and it's engaging because it again activates the imagination, and it's kind of curiosity, a set of curiosities.
How is Jesus presented as a literary fama in the Gospels?
Well, in Mark, he will come into a particular place and say perform a healing or other kind of extraordinary activity. And what Mark says is that the people around him are bewildered. And so I think I gave maybe 3 different examples of this in the Gospel of Mark. And so that, along with the disciples' inability to really understand who he is until I think it's something like chapter 8, right? Like there's a fulcrum where the dialogue changes. Peter says, he says something like, who do people say I am? And then Peter gives the list, and after that it becomes, he moves towards the city and it becomes clearer what his mission, so-called, is going to be. So that is what happens, I think, in the Gospel of Mark specifically. You see the word elsewhere in the Gospels, and indeed throughout Greek literature, Greek and Roman literature. But in the Gospel of Mark specifically, what again is usually called the messianic secret, this idea that people aren't quite sure who he is, that is specifically using that language of thauma whenever it takes place in the text.
What exactly is the messianic secret?
So it's the way that this man, William Verda, argues for trying to understand the curious aspect of the Gospel of Mark where it seems that people aren't quite sure who he is. So that term is something he titles his book, originally it was in German, but that's how he titles his book. I think that as a description of one of these features of the Gospel of Mark, it's actually it's apt in the sense that it seems that there is some kind of secrecy in the Gospel of Mark. Again, back to what we were talking about with Christology, that there's a reason, for some reason, Mark wants Jesus to be this more mysterious figure. Unlike something, say, the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus explains his teachings in a much more clear way. There isn't this ambiguity about what he means. Matthew will tell you where in the Holy Scriptures you can refer back to understand the context of Jesus as something like a new Moses. Luke, of course, much more literary, gives you much more context for many of the scenes. He adds a lot more detail than Mark does. But even in Mark's sentence structure, it's very much shrouded in kind of, I said ambiguity, but also like the brevity of it leaves a lot open to the reader to interpret. And this goes all the way to the ending of Mark, which I'm sure you've had people on the show before talking about the original ending versus the longer ending. But just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the Gospel of Mark originally ended, at least the older versions of it that we have, with the women afraid and running away. And so that as an ending continues the theme throughout Mark of a sense of secrecy, or at least not this lack of clarity of Jesus, who he was, the significance of what's happening. People just seem sort of confused. And as an ending for the women to run away, confused, and say nothing to anyone, that's a terrible ending if you're trying to explain how Christianity eventually, makes it out into the empire and everyone finds out about Jesus. So at some point, someone added a longer ending of Mark with the appearances and so forth, right? And it was kind of an answer to that larger schema of mystery in the text. So that's generally what people mean by it. But again, it's a description, but I don't know that it's one that fully attends to where you see that kind of thematic inflection or strategy in other texts like Virgil.
Can you tell us about Francois Bowen's suggestion that Luke has an affinity for dates?
That's really funny. I mean, he's the one, Luke, um, who is trying to ground, at least, at certain points in his gospel. I think this is what you mean. Like who Quirinius, right, as governor of Syria. Like he tries to throw in those details throughout. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah. So affinity for dates is a charming way to put it. We might have talked. Francois was one of my professors, so we were quite close. I actually helped him with his Luke books, a few of them. Like those were my first publications, and so I think he does. Affinity is a nice way, I think, and I don't want to speak again for Francois, but a nice way of saying that Luke tries to put in those kinds of details for sure, and ground the text in a way say Mark doesn't, right? The problem, of course, is that a lot of the dates don't seem quite right, but that is a nice illustration of what we've been talking about in terms of how much can you extract from these texts about history, about a concrete history. Just because Luke might be a little confused about when Quirinius was governor doesn't mean he's not kind of correct about something, right? Like he's ballparking it, and if you have a flexible mindset and you're not trying to hold him to task too firmly, he's giving you some interesting information that sounds reasonable and credible enough. So I think that's the affinity there. To, as a reader, you feel a little more secure.
So now I want to shift back to Mark. How does Mark? Can you talk about Mark's portrayal of Jesus as a wonder worker?
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting wonder worker in the text. And I mean, this maybe not what you are thinking of, but one thing that always stands out to me is I'm one of the scholars who's fairly persuaded by the idea that probably Mark, whoever he was aware of the letters of Paul at some point. How much of Paul's corpus, I don't know. Which specific letters, I don't know. But I think that it's fair to say that how he constructs things like the healings and the wonder working requires an understanding of Middle Platonic ideas in philosophical physics, especially Stoicism, that is also prevalent throughout Paul's letters. And we've talked about this before. So the way that the healings tend to work is that in the Greek, it's sometimes instead of a specific disease or a demon, it's something like bad pneuma is the word in the Greek. And so Jesus is actually dispatching that bad pneuma through his God-given pneuma. There's all kinds of stuff that we associate with the word spirit that gets a little bit more concrete, as I say, in terms of things like Stoic physics, if you look at the 1st and 2nd centuries. So with that in mind, it's very interesting to me that a lot of the wonder working in Mark on Jesus's behalf, which include things, again, like demon healings and getting rid of demons or talking to demons, that's the kind of stuff that it seems to me when Paul talks about his pneumatic demonstrations in his letters could be similar to what he is thinking about there, because he's also talking about things like speaking in tongues in that text and other kinds of activities that are generally spirit or pneuma driven. And so that's one interesting aspect of the text that I see, that it's usually almost always with the wonder working some kind of spirit or pneuma, or the other word you sometimes see is power, so dunamis in Greek. One example that always stands out to me actually is in Mark 5, if I could get specific. So the hemorrhaging woman, if you look at the text, it's very interesting. The woman touches Jesus's garment and a power shoots out of him almost passively because of her pistis, her faith. So she has sufficient faith so that when she grabs the cloak, power emanates out of Jesus. And you always get the sense that, it's behind him, that he's passed by, and then she grabs onto him. And then she gets kind of this jolt, is sort of how I imagine it, because she has that precondition of faith to receive power from Jesus. And he turns around and he says, like, who touched me? Like, what was that, essentially? So you get this idea of powers, spirits, other kinds of activity that are active in this world that is being created by Mark, that Jesus has a mastery over for sure. But also in a case like the hemorrhaging woman, he didn't intentionally even heal her, but he's so imbued with this God-given power and this God-given spirit that he's able to do these things, even if it is just behind his back.
Can you talk about some of the parallels between Jesus and Aesop, Moses, Odysseus, and others that you talk about? And feel free to give a couple of specific examples if you want.
Sure, I think that I mentioned Aesop and Socrates before. So in terms of this idea of city and country, I mentioned that usually the city is kind of corrupting on some level for many figures. And I'm sure people listening will think of other examples. And we don't even have to focus on Jesus to think about this. I mean, one other character is John the Baptist, right? You know, once he leaves the Jordan and leaves the Galilee, or, you know, these areas, more rural areas where he's living this ascetic life, trouble brews. And so you see that with someone like Socrates or Aesop, and other scholars have written about this. I think one scholar who has is Paul Robertson, that many things related to the death of, say, Socrates looks like what you have in the Gospels, including things like a cock crowing before death as being almost like a herald of death. And I think in Socrates' case that he was charged with his kind of philosophical teachings corrupting the youth. That's something you see a version of that attributed to someone like Paul in the Acts of Paul. And it's not that Jesus was necessarily corrupting the youth, but that idea of what Jesus' teachings are being subversive, or him being a subversive figure, I think also holds. And then the other thing with Aesop, of course, too, he travels around, so switching to Aesop, but he's a subversive figure. I had a chapter about this in my book on the origins of Christian literature. I think it's the last chapter where I talk about other subversive figures, and Aesop is one of my main examples. He's also getting by on his wits. For the most part, he's not supposed to be attractive at all, but he still seems to attract because of his message, his wittiness, and the quality of his teachings, essentially, attention. And Jesus is a wonder worker, yes, and Mark, but he is also a teacher. And it's the quality of those ideas, his philosophical reflections, but also his ethics that he brings forward as he goes around. Although, of course, in Mark, as we've been talking about, is a little more esoteric. But he does give these teachings, and people are attracted to that. And so he does look like these other figures in that respect. And you mentioned Moses. I mean, I think if we imagine Matthew using Mark as a quote-unquote source, when he goes to write his gospel, which is generally held by the field, he does make Jesus look like Moses in a number of ways. One is that Jesus tends to give sermons in the Gospel of Matthew, more than sort of one-off teachings, which is what you have in Mark, which I think of as more characteristic of someone like an Aesop. And I think, too, you have something like the Sermon on the Mount, which I think we tend to associate with whatever image we have of, let's call it a historical Jesus. But remember, it's Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, it's Sermon on the Plain in Luke, right? So you put Jesus on a mountain to essentially give his own version of the commandments, but his twist on the traditional, 10 commandments or these rules of living is that not only do you have to uphold sort of the Mosaic law, but he says he's here to intensify it. So it's not only that you can't commit adultery, you shouldn't even look at your neighbor's spouse. It's not that you shouldn't, harbor any kind of ill will to your neighbor, but like if that's even in your heart, that's bad enough, never mind acting on it, right? So he keeps saying that he's here to intensify. So he gives, in the end, I think 5 sermons in Matthew, so 5 books of Moses. He intensifies the law on a mountain, just the way Moses did with the 10 Commandments. So those kinds of echoes are there to tell you about an interpretation the author has of the kind of Jesus he wants to put forward. But it's also there, I think, as an indication of how you, as the reader, as the audience, is supposed to understand this figure, which is particularly interesting if we think outside of the idea of these texts being written by and for a community of fellow Christians, and think about how these texts also functioned in a broader society in the ancient Mediterranean world. If you are encountering Jesus for the first time, then you're getting a very interesting interpretation of how you're supposed to understand him as a historical figure, but also as somebody worthy of attention.
So when you say that when Jesus is walking on water or going to the Gennesaret and doing other healings, and you say that these are Mark putting in details that are Herodotan like facts, um, what do you mean by that?
Well, Herodotus loved to pepper his texts with, random facts, not quite like a paradoxographer, but he's sort of known, there's kind of a whole kettle of fish here, but he was sort of known to give more extraordinary facts that were a little bit more dubious maybe, or harder to believe than, say, Thucydides. So often Herodotus is compared to Thucydides. A great scholar who's written on this is Suzanne Marchand, who just had an article come out about Thucydides and Herodotus, and she points out there that Thucydides is associated often with like a sober kind of history writing that's very serious, that tries to give you like, an accurate account without too much fluff or too many extraordinary kind of dubious events, versus Herodotus, who was eventually, by the Victorian era, actually turned into children's books. So that's the kind of quality of history we're talking about, at least how it was interpreted by the Victorian era, because there would be more extraordinary tales. I think he opens up with a tale about somebody who rode a dolphin like hundreds of miles across the ocean, like that kind of thing. And so I think when you consider that you're being asked in the Gospels to accept some pretty extraordinary ideas, you're being asked to accept things like somebody raising someone from the dead. Like obviously these are things that if at first blush you're not accustomed to this kind of storytelling, or you're not already sort of initiated into understanding the significance of Jesus and human history and so forth, that's going to be a bit of a challenge and kind of on par with some of the extraordinary things that Herodotus tells you.
Can you tell us about how did Megan Henning influence your contribution?
Oh, that's a great question. By the way, I see my lights flickering. There's a thunderstorm outside, so if you lose me, I apologize ahead of time.
Oh, no problem.
She has done extraordinary work in the realms of things like disability studies, but as well in this particular volume, I believe she did something on books as objects. And I saw that as an interesting corollary to something that I was trying to drive at, which is the way that something like the Gospel of Mark and the idea of the book itself can be a location for thinking through the significance of the kind of themes that I think the whole volume is dealing with. So I've really appreciated her work in that realm. But I've appreciated her work even more broadly outside of this volume on disability studies. And also she had a recent book on constructions of hell that was very challenging, but really, I think, revolutionary. And so I encourage everybody to check out her work. It's truly excellent. And she's a great contributor to this volume as well.
So my final question, what conclusion did you put forth that you want people to pay attention to when looking at the Gospels and trying to find any historical kernel of truth, but also looking at the complexity of the complications, that is, of the fact that the Gospels are filled with Greco-Roman literary tropes?
Well, I would say if I could indulge in like a two-prong answer to that, one would be to not be content with our traditional ways of classifying the Gospels in terms of something like, say, the Messianic secret, but also thinking purely in terms of something like a Christology. Because if we expand our thinking and do more of the kind of comparative work we've been talking about, then I think you can start to deconstruct something like the so-called Messianic secret and understand it in a new key. And I think that adds to our theoretical understanding of the historical value of something like the Gospels. I would hope that one thing that comes out of this volume as a whole is the benefit of a self-reflection. And I think that the field is doing a self-reflection through this volume and through the efforts of someone like Chris Keith and James Crossley to really understand how do we change traditional ways of approaching these materials to have new approaches, new methods, and new conversations. And we've been talking again today just because of my personal academic interests and how you can reimagine literature and the Gospels as literature. And that is one, not particularly new per se, but one way that I think that we can try to have, again, new conversations that aren't rooted purely in seeing these as quote unquote religious texts or seeing these only through a lens of religious practice, but also trying to reincorporate the Gospels into this larger panoply of ancient Mediterranean literature where they belong, because it's at the deficit of both fields like classics and religious studies to not always keep that into account or take that into account when we're evaluating the Gospels, because there are ways that we can just be too myopic or look too much at the theological significance and not the literary significance of these works.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Robyn.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.